And I'm always going to be raging against the machine, because that's what an artist does. And, you know, I don't know any good artist that feels like comfortable anywhere.
Hello and welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival. It's so nice to see so many of you, and to you watching at home, hello as well. My name is Heather Parry, and I'm just so glad to be here today with one of, I'm going to say it, the most exciting writers that we have, I think. You can blush, it's fine. Ottessa Moshfegh is a fiction writer from New England. Her debut novel, Eileen, was shortlisted for the 2016 Booker Prize, and she's since published the critically acclaimed novels My Year of Rest and Relaxation and Death in Her Hands, plus my personal favorite, a novella entitled Maglue. Today, we're celebrating her fascinating new novel, Lapvona, which is right here. Please welcome Ottessa Moshfegh.
Hi.
How you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm pretty good. So just to let you know how the event's going to go today, Ottessa is going to do a little reading for us, and then we're going to have a conversation about the book. And then at the end, we'll have like 10, 15 minutes for audience questions. The online audience can put their questions, not answers, that would be weird, questions to the Q&A function, and they will come to this magical little tablet here. And then there will also be a signing by Ottessa at the signing tent after, and you can buy the book from the book festival shop, which you should, and then she'll sign it for you. All nice. Value for money. Would you like to start us out with a reading?
Yeah, sure, I'd love to. The book is structured seasonally, and it begins with spring, and it ends with spring, so it sort of covers this entire year cycle. And I'm just going to read the beginning of spring, which is the opening of the book. The bandits came again on Easter. This time they slaughtered 2 men, 3 women, and 2 small children. Some smelting tools were stolen from the blacksmith, but no gold or silver, as there was none. One of the bandits was injured by an axe wielded by the slain children's mother. She smashed his left foot. Then he was restrained by neighbors and dragged to the village square, where he was beaten and put in the pillory. Villagers pelted him with mud and animal excrement until nightfall. Grigor, the dead children's grandfather, was too bereft to sleep. So he got up in the night, went to the square, cut off the bandit's ear with a garden knife, and flung it in a lemon tree laden with blossoms. For the birds to eat, he yelled at the bleeding man and sobbed as he slunk away. Nobody could say what specific acts of horror this one pilloried bandit had committed. The rest of the bandits got away and took with them 6 geese, 4 goats, 6 wheels of cheese, and a cask of honey, in addition to the iron tools. No lambs were stolen, as the lamb herder, Jude, lived in a pasture several miles from the center of the village, and he had his lambs penned and sleeping soundly that night as usual. The pasture was at the foot of a hill, on top of which sat the large stone manor where William, Lapvona's lord and governor, resided. His guards were in position to defend him should any menacing individual ever climb the hill. Between the echoing screams from the village, Jude thought he could hear the gut strings of the guards' bows tighten from where he lay awake by the fire that night. It was not by chance that Jude and his son, Marek, lived in the pasture below the manor. William and Jude shared a blood relation, their great-grandfather. Jude thought of William as his cousin, even though the 2 men had never met. On Monday, Marek, age 13, walked to the village to assist the men in digging a trench to bury the dead. He wanted to be helpful, but cowered when the bodies were laid out on the thick grass of the cemetery and the men took up their shovels. The heads of the dead were covered only in thin cloths. Marek imagined that their faces were still alive. He could see their eyelashes grazing the fabric as a soft wind blew. He saw the outlines of their lips and thought they were moving, speaking to him, warning him to get away. The children's bodies looked like wooden dolls, stiff and adorable. Marek crossed himself and retreated back to the road. The men of the village dug the trench easily without him anyway. Nobody cared that Marek had come and gone. He was like a stray dog that wandered in and out of the village from time to time, and everybody knew he was a bastard. Okay, I'll just end there.
I'm really interested to hear you describe this book, Ottessa, because I think it defies easy description.
How do you describe it? I think of it as a journal entry from a time in my life that was very exciting and isolated at home during the pandemic. It's the most personal book I've ever written. It's the first novel I've written in the third person, and is a book that, for me, tried to engage in the art of storytelling in a moment where my own worldview had shifted from a sort of myopic, internal place to one that was necessarily of a global perspective, watching the world shift. And it really, shifted the way I thought about the kind of stories I wanted to tell, where they were coming from within me, and what I was witnessing in the world, and how I wanted to respond to it. So in that sense, it is, a journal entry. In another sense, it's a saga. It's a fairy tale and a dark comedy. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's kind of all of those things.
That's very interesting that you say it's quite a personal book, and slightly worrying given the content of it. But yeah, now you mention it, I suppose the rest of your books tend to be focused on like one main character, mm-hmm. whereas this one has a whole cast of characters, like you say, it is kind of a saga. And you have very interesting relationships between the characters. But I would love to know like why in lockdown, when many people were writing kind of like escapist, like things to make them feel good about the world. Is this something that made you feel good about the world, or was it a processing?
It actually, like, I was really happy writing this novel. And what can I say? I mean, this was my escapist novel. Like, I was literally going to another world. I mean, not that every fictional landscape is another world, literally, but this one was one that felt so distant from where I was, literally. I wrote this book in Pasadena, and outside of Los Angeles in California, USA. And yeah, I spent 95% of my waking hours like looking at a digital screen, which is a very different time and place and way of using your mind than the late Middle Ages and some maybe anonymous fiefdom. And so I just went there. I mean, I just like went to Lapvona every day and hung out and had a great time. Never boring.
And what brought you to that period in time, do you think?
I think partly it was a lot of things. And I think most writers will say something similar about like how they arrived to write the book, that the universe seemed to be conspiring toward that. on the one hand, right before the pandemic, not knowing that we were going to be stuck at home, we moved into a house outside of the city of Los Angeles, which I never thought I would want to live in, this kind of neighborhood of this, like, I'm from the suburbs, and I really never thought I wanted to go back to the suburbs. But we had found this house, and it was a really unusual house. It was made of stones, which I hadn't thought about at the time, are very old. You know, like things like those things that you take for granted. It's like I was home, you know, for months and months, and I was like, oh, one day it occurred to me, these stones are so old. I was like, okay, that's something. That's a thought, you know? And they were old, and they had been repurposed to build this house about 100 years earlier. And many of them were from a church that had been leveled in an earthquake. And so that material felt charged and nearby, and like it was protecting me. So that was one thing. The other thing was, in wanting to use your word, write like something escapist and interesting for me to escape into, I was definitely like going back to my childhood and going back to what I thought my imagination did around storytelling. Like, when I was in the first grade, age 6, in elementary school, we had this very boring librarian who was, in hindsight, very strange, because she did it, this wasn't part of her job. She just elected to have each class come visit her once a week to sit on the rug in the library, and she had made this board made of felt, and had made all these little figures made of felt, and she would tell these extremely long and boring fairy tales, and like peeling the felt people off and on to illustrate. And I just, like, you know, every time I went there, it was like a major existential crisis. Like, what is time? What is consciousness? How long am I going to be here? And I think that was part of it. You know, that was part of like me going back to what is time? How am I, like what am I doing here? And the other thing was really wanting to be surprised, and wanting to write in outside of my own element. I mean, a lot of people could read this book if they'd read my previous work. They're like, oh, I totally see how, like, I see her like in that. But to me, I was like, this is something new. It's something so unlike everything else that I've written. And yeah, I just wanted to go like beyond my usual fiction.
And do you think that reflects like a confidence in your career? Like having done so well with your other books and, you know, taking that leap into like a more freeing space?
I mean, I think to an extent you could say that, although it's not a conscious thought. I mean, I've kind of always felt like you should just do whatever you want, except for the one time I was like, I should try writing a novel, you know, which I didn't know I wanted to do, which was Eileen, and which was a very focused effort because I had no success to write something that had the potential for success, having come from the short story form. But no, now, I mean, you know, I have a lot of different projects happening, and I think one thing I can say is, given a certain amount of comfort, like I feel freed up a bit in life and in like my creative work to explore things that are more personal and spiritual rather than necessarily like the dynamics of a relationship or a scenario. Like I feel like I have a little bit more space. And maybe that's just getting older as well.
I think that like a through line from this book with your other work is like the concept of self-delusion. which is one that I'm really interested in as well. Like, I think a lot of your characters are, like, engaging in various levels of self-delusion. And I previously wondered if that was, like, you thought that was a almost reasonable response to the, like, contemporary world. But with this book, it made me think that maybe you feel it's something more kind of, like, inherent in humanity. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I totally agree with you that it's inherent in humanity. And I think, one thing that, that like really lame thought that everybody has when like the first or second time they get stoned and they're like, how do I know green looks green to you? And it's like not that interesting of a thought, but it's a little bit similar to the lame thought I will next convey, which is like, I'm very coming from. No, there's absolutely nothing special about my background. I'm just like a human being using language. I was about to like make it historical, but which I can later. But I think what is basically true is that language is limited, and it's a fucking coincidence that anyone ever understands anyone else. And so, like, knowing that, God, we all have our own paradigms for what the heck is going on, who we are, who you are, how I need to be, how I need to think. Like, we think about how we're thinking. I mean, it's so incredibly abstract in so many ways, but yet, like, we want to communicate it, and it's a miracle that we can sort of get our thoughts across. What was your question? Because I have gone like way...
The question was about self-delusion, but I feel like this is way more interesting as an answer.
Yeah, so I'm like, okay, if language is this really limited thing, nobody's really truly understanding each other because, we're at this moment in time in the culture that I'm from, I don't see people studying like psychic ability in a sincere way. Like, I know that we teach kids, or I don't have kids, but like I've noticed that like people teach kids how to be like compassionate and to see things from different perspectives and stuff like that. But like, and I think that's important to understand one another. But I still think that delusion will exist until like we can all speak just like aliens using
the CIA must
radio waves. That, right? I don't know, yeah.
One of the other things I really like about your work is you write women who like refuse society's roles for them. And I feel like in this book, Ina, would you pronounce it Ina?
I would.
Ina. She's the kind of sort of pinnacle of that like work, I think. And I find it so interesting, like it's the cardinal sin in society's eyes that you refuse to fit into these roles as a woman, I think. And I love that you've got like such an interesting exploration of that. So can you talk about a little bit about her role in the village?
Yeah, sure. So Ina is a character in Lapvona that is unlike all the other characters. She, when you meet her, she's already something like 100 or 200 or 500 years old. I mean, it's never specified. There's only speculation. And we meet her at the end of one career, which is that she had been she had been a midwife, but she had been the wet nurse for basically everyone in Lapvona for a couple of generations. And at this point, she's old and her milk has dried out, but she still maintains some relationships with people in the village, most notably Marek, who is the adolescent boy that you heard introduced at the beginning of the book. Ina has a strange ability, even though she's blind. Maybe I should say because she is blind, she was blinded by a plague, of which she was the only survivor, and was kind of cast out of the village when that happened because nobody trusted that she was good and human. The miracle of her survival was somehow suspect. She was cast out of society and learned to live as a newly blind teenage girl in the forest and in nature by herself, and basically like became part of nature, learned bird song and everything that she could possibly know about herbs and how to, where to sleep. I mean, I don't even know. I'm definitely not a survivalist at all. I'm like, Ina is nothing like me, by the way. Like, I can't go anywhere without using the GPS on my iPhone. But I don't know how to talk to birds. Maybe if I did, it would be different. So Ina is sort of a mythical character and has no children, miraculously produced breast milk at some point, which inspired her to return to society and to connect with people. And, she's unwed, which is something that comes up in the book, looking for love. And, anything more, I feel like I'm kind of giving things away.
Well, to me, she's kind of like a symbol for how even kind of pre-capitalist societies were very extractive of women's bodies. This is something we think of capitalism, but obviously before it was the same. But for me, she's really interesting because she understands that value in herself and is very manipulative to others around her, to her own ends, with that in mind. Does that resonate with your intention for that character?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like in writing this book, I guess I came up against what I thought was one of my prime stupidities, and that is that I tend to think that people in the past didn't have thoughts the way that we have them now. And that, like, if we, read about, the history of the oppression of women and wonder about it, we're like, well, women really didn't know that they actually did have power. Like, they didn't need anyone to give them rights. Like, they had those. And I'm like, oh, they just didn't know that. And I'm like, of course they knew it. Of course they did. Of course they would get together and be like, oh my God, my husband is so annoying. He's always trying to control me. And he doesn't know, blah, blah, I'm just like, of course they. So I didn't think it was an anomaly that Ina was aware of her standing and the opportunity she had as a female human being to make use of what could be extracted, I didn't see her. I didn't realize how manipulative she was until later on in the book. At the beginning, I just kind of saw her as I was a little bit afraid of her. Yeah.
I suppose, they're all quite manipulative characters in their own ways, but with Ina, it sticks out because she is doing it in such an unusual way compared to the rest of them. It feels like she's kind of the puppet master for the whole town. Because, I mean, if we thought about characters of power in this book, people might say William, but I feel like it's actually Ina. Do you think so too?
There's different kinds of power, right? I mean, William is the Lord, and, there's also a priest that has his own kind of power. Those men have the power to directly manipulate and control the people, while Ina is sort of more psychological. I mean, at one point, she goes around the village and sort of promises that she can help couples to conceive, even though there'd just been a horrible famine and surely the women were not fertile. No one, all that kind of stuff. And it's like definitely a hoax, where she, she goes around offering like basically like massages to the men, and so I think there's like this kind of wink about like how she understands human vulnerability, but at the same time there's also this what feels to me like a scary use of nature, or a scary promise that, I'm not quite sure what Ina's concept of God is. And she was the one that, obviously fascinated me the most because I didn't understand her.
Mm. She's also like a symbol of the really unusual kind of like parent-child roles in Lapvona. And I don't mean necessarily for actual parents and actual children, but you kind of explore, to my mind, like the way that those roles are almost a need in people.
Innate?
In a need. So
a need.
Like, so it's like people need to be parented. They need to parent almost, regardless of whether they are children or, our parents or whatever. Like we have a child suckling a lamb. A man replaces his son with another. And there's this kind of like, really kind of like transactional way of looking at that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And when you were talking about fairy tales before and you felt fairy tales, I think there's like a link between those two, right? Because parenting in fairy tales is like bizarre and awful. Mm-hmm. Do you think like that's where that came from, or is that intentional to kind of take that thread through?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know, but the premise of the story, which is one boy accidentally on purpose causes the death of another boy, and that dead boy's father decides to take his son's killer in as a replacement son. Like, that was the premise. That was like what I went into the story with. And yeah, so I guess inherently there's something about the role of parent and child that was going to permeate thematically throughout the whole, I almost said movie, throughout the whole book. But I wasn't thinking about that as a theme. Mm-hmm. But like, yeah, certainly, I mean, yeah, parents, having had parents and having parents, I know very well the power of that experience. So it's probably just in everything that I write. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know.
Good answer.
Okay.
I wanted to ask about, like, there's a real overlay. You mentioned there's a priest in the book, but also there's, like, faith that's outside of religion as well as inside religion. And there's a kind of brutal exploration of, like, human nature that overlays with that. Can you talk a little bit about how you wanted to present faith in this book?
I wanted to present faith as being subjective and then ask about the possibility of it being that God being an objective truth. Mm-hmm. So every character, there are several different realms in Lapvona. There are the villagers, and there's Jude and Marek, who are they're sort of outsiders. There's the Lord, and then there's the entire world of, his manor, which includes him, his wife, the priest who visits a lot, who's like his bosom buddy, basically, and his son / not son, and then a team of servants who have a different kind of faith. So, I wanted to explore faith in each of those realms, what kind of faith and what its use is. Mm-hmm. And then ultimately to just sort of explore my own faith, I guess, as the author, not me, Ottessa, but the author's faith and how it is translated in the story.
Do you mean faith in the book or faith in like the writing process?
Good question. Certainly, I mean, I have a faith that is basically like my entire religion is faith in like the creative process. That's how I like understand the universe. But as the author, and I guess I should say author/narrator of the book, I didn't realize that the narrator was a character in the book until like the very end of the book, and that the narrator was telling the story for a reason particular to them, which was to examine the way that they illustrate faith through the story they're telling, and that was kind of like a one-off of me. I'm not the narrator, but I am, you know? It's like, yeah, so I mean, I wasn't like wrestling with like Christianity or like, you know, I wasn't trying to make sense of, history, really, but I was trying to make sense of how it's possible that, like, we've managed to survive this long when our nature is to destroy the planet and each other. Like, there's got to be something. So that's sort of what I was looking at.
I've heard you say as well that your characters kind of present themselves to you, and it's your job to kind of get out of the way. Is that what you mean when you say like faith in the kind of creative process?
That's definitely part of it. I mean, definitely like stepping aside to let the book happen, for sure. And yeah, the writing process for me, you know, it's funny because like at the beginning we were talking about, you were saying my previous novels are very much, you know, first person narratives and really about this very specific character from the inside out. And without that crutch, I realized that that had been a crutch, that I knew exactly how to embody a character and speak, let them speak as the narrator of their own story. But I hadn't written a book by a narrator narrating about a bunch of other people. So I needed to sort of expand my idea of the magic that can happen in writing to one that would include narrating in the third person. And I found that actually it was more exciting. There felt to be like more at risk because there were more characters at stake, and the faith in the creative writing process was much more story-based than it was character-based. Like in Eileen, for example, you know, I was writing to find a way for Eileen to find freedom or whatever it was that she was finding. In my year of rest and relaxation, I was writing to find, freedom or whatever it was that the unnamed protagonist was trying to find. And in this, I was actually, in Lapvona, I was trying to find something completely different and more universal. For me, it was actually just like way more fun. Like I felt like I needed to control even less.
And I suppose a lot of the tension from the book comes from us not being let into the internal lives of the characters so much, so we don't really ever know what they're going to do. Which is, I suppose, like, because the time would have been slightly more nihilistic in that sense, because, you know, have very desperate people, so they are acting kind of beyond logic anyway. But yeah, I think the third person really adds to that as well. Did you feel like that?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think the third person point of view, you can surprise the reader in ways that they're like, you know, because the reader doesn't know the characters as well. So if they do something, quote unquote, out of character, it isn't unbelievable. Something like that.
Yeah, let's go with that. Ottessa is like a little bit jet lagged, so you're doing amazingly well with these questions, by the way.
Thanks.
You mentioned the like dark humor in the book and how much fun you've had with it. And I hate to quote writers back to them, but I love the line, excrement, is that like a sacrament? Which seemed to kind of like sum up what you're doing so much. And without giving anything away about what happens in the book, it really made me feel of books like, books like 120 Days of Sodom, where you like literally cannot write about the things that happen in that book. You can't write about like people like farting in each other's mouths and it not be funny. Is that like something you like were just pulling at the kind of edges of extreme and then seeing where it became like funny?
No, I kind of think that's just my sense of humor.
Really?
I mean, I think there's more to the humor of the book than excrement jokes.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's like the kid in me that wants to point out the absurdity of all of these complex systems of thought, when at the end of the day, you know, we all do what we do on the toilet. Hopefully.
I wanted to ask you as well, we mentioned this a little bit like in our pre-event chat, but we talked about like the response, I think, especially to women who write quite dark things in their works. And I don't know how you feel about this, but I feel like there is often a kind of moral element to the critique of women's writing when they're writing dark or extreme or weird things, but pretty much only when they aren't based on their own pain and suffering. How do you feel about that?
I need to unpack that a bit. So you're saying that it seems to you that there's more moral judgment toward female writers when they're not writing about their own suffering.
But they're still writing about dark things. They're still writing about people acting badly to each other. They're still writing about like weird, dark, kind of extreme things.
Yeah. Well, I think that's because we're still stuck in this kind of primate biology thing where we need to see women as caretakers. Like, we're very young in that sense as a group of human beings. So, yeah, I think it's still uncomfortable. I mean, this is just my opinion, and I'm happy that if anyone disagrees with it. But I think people are still uncomfortable with women having darkness, period. It's like something to be dismissed and something also kind of wrong and selfish, because women should really be making the world a smilier place. And I just think, like, I would rather die than have to be that person. And yet I feel the shame, the internalized shame of not being that person constantly.
Really?
Oh, yeah. For sure. I mean, it's not comfortable that, like, the thing that I felt called to do with my life is so easily dismissed by some people as, some, like, dark, shit-obsessed, female thing that's like some fad, that I'm not actually a writer, but that I'm like a symbol of some kind of psychology for people.
Right.
Like, I'm a writer. Like, I do that. Like, what I write about and however you feel about it is very different from the fact that like I have studied writing my entire life, and I do it with dedication. Like my life depends on it. And to be, you know, to be seen as like anything less than that, you know, is like, that makes me feel horrible, basically.
And do you feel like when you're writing, do you feel like you rail against this kind of like expectation, or do you think it's kind of irrelevant to your process?
I don't feel like I'm railing against the expectation now. I feel like I was in Eileen, but that was just like, honestly, like, it was like I picked the topic out of a hat. It could have been anything. Like, I'm being honest. Like, I like writing about all kinds of things. And I think I have been writing about all kinds of things. And I'm always going to be raging against the machine, because that's what an artist does. And, you know, I don't know any good artist that feels like comfortable anywhere.
Yeah, we could have a whole conversation about the psychology of writers in particular. We are going to go to questions in a second, but I did want to ask, just as a fan of yours, what you're working on now, or if you are working on a book now.
I'm sort of, I'm not actively working on a book right now, but I have 2 novels, and one of them is set in Brighton, and I have never been to Brighton. So I'm hoping to make it down to Brighton at some point on my journey here. So yeah, I have one that's really just still germinating. It's a story that takes place in, I think, probably like the early 90s in Brighton for some reason. And then another book project that's a really long-term project that takes place at the turn of the 20th century. It starts in Shanghai and goes to San Francisco, and it's a ghost story, basically.
Oh, wow. And how easy do you find it to keep different, like completely different projects like that in your head, or like on the go in various different stages?
I just don't. Like, I just turn one off, and I give my attention to the one that I feel is, I don't know, the timing is right. And that happens in between working on a bunch of other stuff that has nothing to do with the novels, so, yeah.
I can't wait to read the Brighton one in particular.
Thanks.
I'm going to pull up some questions from our online audience, but if you do have any questions in the room, please put your hand up. We have a couple of roving microphones. Yes, I'm going to go for green shirt at the front here.
Hi.
Hi, yeah, just such an interesting discussion. Thank you so much. I sort of wanted to ask more about setting, because I know, Heather, you were sort of mentioning the sort of pre-capitalist setting, and I also found in the book it to be a very tightly defined set. It felt almost like a theatre experience. So I was sort of wondering what that did for you, particularly when the novel touches on areas like environmental change and famine, and sort of political corruption that are obviously very prescient. So, yeah, I was just interested in hearing more about that.
That's an interesting question that you posed in a way that haven't been asked that before. And I think the specificity of it was kind of a way of not having to address the entire world, but still talk about the world. Like, you know, in the same way, if you could say that, you know, a family is kind of like a microcosm of society, and this village is sort of a microcosm of the something on a bigger scale, like a nation or a region of the planet or something. I really didn't want to have to take that on, because I knew that would actually make for a very boring book. And so I turned it. Anytime I felt myself thinking outside of Lapvona, I just went right back in. But certainly, I'm not impermeable, and I was living in the United States in a time, whatever, particular to the U.S. was new for me. And I couldn't not have an experience of it, and that definitely found its way into Lapvona.
Great question. If you put your hands back up, yes, we've got one question at the back.
Hello. Something that I was really curious about is over the course of the pandemic and with the kind of rise of TikTok particularly, your books have gained a lot of attention, and you as a writer, and with My Year of Rest and Relaxation, it tends to be categorised quite often as a book about an unhinged woman, and I wondered what you felt about that, and if you felt it was in any way reductive about the book and your writing as well.
What do you think?
I think it is a bit reductive. I think she is unhinged, but I think that there's a lot more to say about it than that, and I think it's something that's misinterpreted quite freely online, I guess, is my view.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say I'm of two minds. Like, on the one hand, the fact that a generation that uses TikTok is talking at all about a book I've written is an incredible miracle to me. So I feel really blessed in that way, and like it's this thing that exists outside of myself, and I feel like I'm happy to have contributed. And at the same time, I also think the internet is a place where the least common denominator meaning of anything can be agreed on and traded like a commodity. And, that can be very helpful when we're thinking about art and the stories that we tell as exactly what you were talking about before, like a way that society values its moral complexity. Those stories can provide a stage for people to have conversations and also say how they feel about certain things that they wouldn't normally contribute to a conversation. But again, for me, I did not write the book for, I didn't write the book to be experienced, I wrote the book to be experienced as a single consciousness experience, like for you to read it yourself. And so whatever happens after that, I divorce myself from. So, to your question about the word unhinged, I'm just like, I think that what they mean is interesting. Because who is hinged? I don't want to be hinged. So whatever.
That's a good T-shirt to take away from this event. I don't want to be hinged. I'm going to take a question from the online audience. This is from Dr. Gillian M. Thank you both for a great discussion. You're so welcome. Ottessa, I believe classical music was a significant thing in your family and for you in your early life. Is it still a big influence on you? Are there similarities between the commitment required for musicians and writers?
Did this person say they were a doctor?
Doctor, yeah. Okay.
Well, doctor. I absolutely think, to answer your last question first about discipline, that I definitely learned that from being a piano student and being raised by two string musicians who my mother in particular was very passionate in terms of self-discipline. And I also think it's probably in my nature as sort of a type A personality, but yeah, certainly the striving and the practicing, like I practice, what you don't see when you pick up a book is how much that writer practiced, you know? Mm-hmm. I practice all the time in order to write what ends up being published. And musically, I mean, yeah, I think having, you know, I learned to read music before I learned how to read the written word. And I also spent a lot of time in my mother's womb while she was teaching music. And, you know, she had really particular ideas of like how a baby's brain developed. And I've been pretty brainwashed in believing that she was right, that like listening to music as a very small child is good for you and teaches you to have like an innate sense of rhythm. And so I kind of had that a bit. And when I translated that into writing, I found it to be really interesting in all of the, you know, because classical music can be very uptight. And so a lot of the times when I'm writing, like I'm aware of what I'm resisting in myself, which is that very uptight rhythm. And that's kind of where I find the exciting moments in my own writing, like on the line sentence level.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Thank you, Doctor. I think we've probably got time for 2 more questions. So if you put your hand up and I'll pick 2. I'm going to go for the cream coat here, and I'm going to go for blue shirt after, if that's okay.
Hi. I wanted to ask if disgust was an important thing for you to bring up within the reader while they were reading Lapvona. I noticed it within the characters, whether it's kind of Jude's self-disgust or Lisbeth's disgust with William and Marek, and whether that was echoed in the kind of revulsion that I felt being brought up for me, or if it was something entirely different, if it was intentional or not.
Absolutely. I think there's a great amount of disgust in Lapvona because there is a lot of disgusting stuff and disgusting people. And I don't talk about this that much, but I wanted to say like goodbye to sort of an addiction to disgust. Disgust has been, in my experience, insofar as I'm aware of what I feel, like one of my primary emotions, like, you know, when people are like rageaholics, where they like instead of feeling anything complicated, they'll just get angry. Like I just get disgusted. And so I was looking at that a lot and wanted, you know, it was definitely going to be part of this project, but also wanted to sort of say goodbye to it and move on to more of the complexities. So I really just allowed my characters to have the disgust they had and to do the disgusting things that they felt compelled to do. Yeah.
Great question. And we're going to go to the blue shirt.
I wonder whether you ever go back to Lapvona these days to hang out with your characters, or have you just sealed them on your mind, or do they still keep any secrets from you? Are you in touch?
I feel like I owe Marek an email. Like I have that kind of feeling. Like I never wrote him back. But you know, I dedicated this book to my dog, one of my dogs, Walter, who looks like he's from Lapvona. Like if you can imagine a dog from Lapvona, it's Walter. And he's kind of my connection. He remains my connection. I know that sounds so silly, but yeah, I feel like we're both from there now.
I just have one last question. I know you take a lot of stock and a lot of pleasure in naming characters and things in your book. Mm-hmm. Where did Lapvona come from?
You know, without realizing it, I had been trying to get at it from even before I knew that I was going to write a book called Lapvona. When I moved to Pasadena, which sounds a little, I mean, you can kind of hear it, Pasadena, Lapvona. There were all these new towns, and the names of the towns were like Monrovia, Arcadia, there was one other, and I was like, oh, that's the best word ever, and I'm going to write a book about, like, that's just going to be the name. Obviously, I've forgotten it. So when it came to Lapvona, I knew there was going to be a V in the middle of it because that's like I don't know, kind of like a little Easter egg thing for me. I think when a V is in the middle of a name, it has a certain kind of power. And for a while, I wasn't sure. I thought it was Lapvonia, and then that seemed too many syllables. And then Lapvona, lap. I mean, there's something about that. I don't know what it is, but I tried not to think too hard. I tried to hear it more than invent it, if you know what I mean.
Okay, that's very interesting. I think we're just kind of out of time, unfortunately. There's so many things to discuss about this book, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to a lot of them, but we only have an hour. However, you can read the book for yourself. Look at that professional segue I did there. You can read the book for yourself by buying it at the festival bookshop, and you can meet Ottessa at the signing tent, and she will sign it for you. We're going to head that way now, so please do stay sat down for a minute so we can get out of the room. But thank you so much for being here. Online audience as well, thank you so much. Huge thank you to the book festival team who are doing incredible work this year. And please give a huge thank you to Ottessa Moshfegh.
And thank you.